Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I want to shoot a little video for you guys on the uses and harvesting of pine sap, or pine pitch as some like to call it. Now what you see here is this is called pine sap or pine pitch. Now pine sap exudes from the wounds of most pine trees. Now this pine sap or pitch has a lot of different uses, whether it be for medicine or whether it be for glue or for fire starting or many other resources that you can use this for. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of that today. Now earlier in the year I did a video on the identification of the white pine, and I also talked a little bit about the uses of the inner bark and how it can be used for medicine, how it can be eaten raw right off of the tree, and how it can even be dried and then ground into a flour. But another nice thing is that if you harvest the inner bark off of a part of a pine tree, you're going to see this here, and you're going to see the sap or this pitch exuding from that wound. Now out in the wild, this is something that you're going to notice. You may not see big clumps like this unless something severe has actually happened to the tree. You may see your pine pitch exuding down the tree like this. And if we follow this up, here we can see this split or this wound in the tree where the sap is exuding. And the pine tree does this so that way it can heal itself. Now when it comes to using this pine sap for medicine, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that you're better off using the sap from the white pine. So if you don't know how to identify the white pine, I'll put a link in the description down below on my identification video on the white pine. Now this sap has multiples of uses, whether it be for a glue or a fire starter or making torches, or whether it be for medicine to help heal up a cut or to help draw out infection, or to even help draw out splinters. All of this sap can be used for all of those things. So this has a lot of uses in a survival situation or even just around your home. This stuff is generally called by a lot of bushcrafters the superglue of the forest because it will glue most anything together. Some things that it doesn't glue together though, things like stainless steel, polyester, nylon, and a lot of synthetic materials don't get glued or sealed by this pitch. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the pine sap and where it comes from and why the tree exudes it, now let's talk a little bit about actually harvesting it, and then let's go inside and let's make some glue out of this stuff. Now whenever I harvest my pine sap or my pine pitch, I actually like to use a knife and a mason jar, especially whenever I'm here at home, and I usually try to carry a mason jar if I'm planning on gathering pine pitch. But you can use any container that you have that'll work for this. And then just simply cut the pine pitch off. It's not easy to cut because it is hard and you are going to get wood in there as well. And you've got to be careful that it doesn't pop off. So you've got to be slow and wiggle the knife in like that. You got to make sure that your knife doesn't pop down because it is sticky. It's very hard, yet it's somewhat soft. And you may notice how in this jar I already have quite a bit of pine sap. So I don't really need to be harvesting any of this. I'm just doing it just so that way you guys can get an idea of how I like to harvest my pine sap. If I look at the underneath part here, because of gravity, the pine sap is going to roll down, it's going to want to drip. Put this stuff on the underside. I'm going to just take my knife sideways and then cut that off. Another thing you want to keep in mind with pine pitch is that you're going to notice various colors. As pine pitch ages, the longer it sits out and oxidizes, it turns into this brown color like you can see here. Whereas the fresher stuff is going to be more white like you can see in the one in the front. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't make any difference as far as uses go. So don't worry about that, whether you're thinking about medicinal uses or you're thinking about glue, because it doesn't seem to matter in my opinion and from my experience. Another thing you may notice whenever you're harvesting your pine pitch is that if it's dark amber like the one you see in the front, it's going to be a lot harder and it's going to be very hard to scrape off. It's going to be almost like amber. Whereas if it's white like you see this one is here, it's going to be a lot softer, so your knife is going to sink into it and you're going to get a lot of goo on your knife, which you're going to anyways. And I like to use a stainless steel knife whenever I'm harvesting my pine pitch because I find that the pine sap doesn't stick to it near as bad. I'm able to wipe it off a lot easier than if I use like a carbon steel. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about how to harvest our pine pitch, let's take this inside and I'll show you guys how to make this into a glue or how to use it for medicine. So let's get started. Alright, now whenever it comes to using your pine sap or your pine pitch, whether that be for medicine or glue, the very first thing that you're going to have to do with it before you can apply it to your skin or apply it to what it is you're trying to seal or glue together, you have to heat it up. And as you can see here, I have my pitch pan, as I like to call it, or my sap pan. And here what you can see is, this is pine sap that has cat fur mixed in it. I just pick cat fur up from my floor and things like that when I'm sweeping, because sometimes the recipe for glue will call for fur or fibrous material, and fur works really well for that. However, you may also see this very smooth and slick stuff here, which there is no fur involved in it, and sometimes what you're trying to glue together will call for that instead. It just really depends on what you're trying to glue together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to heat up all of this pine sap or all of this pitch, so that way I can tilt it all to one side of the pan and we can have this separated. Okay, now while your pine sap or pitch is heating up, it's a good idea to stir it if you can. Now as you can see, this is still very stiff. I'm not able to do very much with it. So it's a good idea for me to just continue to let this sit. And if you guys are seeing any smoke, it's because I just cleaned my burner, so you're just seeing some residual chemicals and food burn off of my burner is really all you're seeing. This is starting to soften up, as you may be able to see here. This is able to move. Now that this is softened up, I'm just going to simply take a paper towel and wipe the inside of this out some. Whenever you're working with pine sap or pine pitch, you have to make sure that it stays warm, because as soon as it cools off, it's going to solidify on you. So the less of an amount you have, like these parts here, are wanting to solidify a lot faster because there's not very much material there. So the stuff can be somewhat tricky to work with if you're not used to working with something that has to be hot. Okay, now this paper towel is going to be a pretty good example of the gluing capabilities of pine sap or pine pitch. Now you may notice that this pitch is black, and there's a reason for that, which I will explain just in a few minutes. Okay, and here you can see I have a really large chunk of some pine sap that I had gathered probably about a year or so ago. Now I'm just simply going to break some of that off because it's very hard and crumbly. And that's another good reason for letting your pine sap sit in what I call temper or age. Maybe even season. I don't really know. Call it whatever you want. But the harder and more amber colored your pine sap is, like you can see here, it kind of looks like a turd. But this amber color is what you want because it's very crumbly and it's very easy to work with without getting your hands sticky. Note that my fingers aren't sticking together here. Whereas if this pine sap was fresh, my fingers would be stuck together like crazy. Now I'm simply going to be tilting my pan just because I don't want the stuff on this side here to catch fire and burn. I just want this to melt and to soften up. That's all I'm wanting right now. And when I'm done inside of this pan, we're going to have two different mixtures here. This is raw, this is cleaned and filtered and mixed with charcoal and cat hair. Whenever you are dealing with the chunks of pine pitch or pine sap off of the tree, there are going to be things like bark, outer bark, inner bark, dirt, dust, needles, pieces of leaves, maybe even small bugs like gnats and flies, and very possibly even bug feces. You know, you never know what's in this stuff. Thankfully though, the pine sap from the pine tree is antibacterial and it's also antibiotic. So you don't have to worry much about bacteria being inside of this. However, for glue, it is important to remove those impurities, and especially for medicine, you don't really want to have chunks of outer bark and other stuff like that in your cut if you're trying to seal it up from those things. Now obviously, if you are trying to apply this pine sap to the skin to maybe help draw out a splinter, or to maybe help seal up a cut from infection, or to help keep it from getting worse, you want this to cool to where it doesn't burn, but you still want it to be applicable or still flexible. So you have to somewhat test it with your fingers to make sure that you can actually do that without burning yourself. That is another very difficult thing for some people to maybe keep in mind when dealing with pine pitch, is that this stuff, it may only be about 120 degrees, but that is very, very hot, and this stuff will stick to you. So because of the fact that you have to use this stuff warm, you have to use it when it's somewhat soft, Be careful to not burn yourself, because this stuff can burn and cause burns like napalm. As a matter of fact, ancient Roman fire, you guys can look it up, one of the main constituents of Roman fire was pine pitch or pine sap. So keep that in mind, is that this stuff can be very, very dangerous if you don't know, or maybe even do know, what you're doing with it. So be careful and do not hurt or burn yourself, please. Okay, now here I can tell that I can touch it because it doesn't hurt. Here you guys may be able to see this consistency. It's very jelly-like. And that's exactly what we want if we're going to apply it to our skin. Let's say if I had a cut right there. See how this is already softened up? And it's stuck. It's stuck here. It's stuck here. So if I want to warm this up, I'm going to actually have to, if I want to get this off of me, I have to stick my finger back in the pan. Which, as you notice, I'm doing that here. And I'm making sure I do it very carefully. And I wanted to do this so you guys could see exactly what can happen if you work too slow or if you work too fast with your pine pitch. Alright, now that I've simply got it warmed up, you just simply spread it on the area whenever it's soft enough to spread. It's very easy to do. Now if you're using this method with the amber colored stuff, you may notice that it will dry very quickly on you. So you've got to work fast. But you got to be careful not burn yourself. But this will work as a really good band-aid to help seal up any wounds or any cuts. It will also help to draw out splinters. This will also help to draw out infections. So this can be very useful not only around the home in a quick pinch, but it can also be very useful in a survival situation if you have nothing else around to help seal up a cut or a wound. And because this was applied fresh with it still soft, it's going to be difficult to remove. You know, I can't really just scrape it right off of there. However, with enough force, it comes off just like a band-aid without leaving any sticky residue on my fingers. Just like a band-aid. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you're using your pine pitch, so that way you don't have to deal with all of the gunk on your hands. Okay, now whenever you want to use your pine sap or your pine pitch for glue, one important thing you're going to need is going to be charcoal. What I have here is just some hardwood charcoal. This is just from my fire pit outside. And you can see here that I have a mortar and pestle. You can use anything that you have on hand to crush this up. We just simply need to grind this up into a powder. Doesn't take very long, thankfully, because it's charcoal. Now the finer we ground this, the more effective our pitch glue is going to be. Alright, now you can see what we have here, this very, very fine charcoal dust. You can test the fineness by rubbing it between your fingers. If it doesn't feel very grainy, then you did a good job. And your pitch glue will be very, very effective. Alright, so whenever your pine sap or your pine pitch has been fully heated up, you can see some of these impurities here. And we can simply drag those to the side. So I'm going to drag it off like that, rub it on the edge of my pan, and see how it's solidifying? We don't even need to worry about it. Now we simply just want to sprinkle a little bit of our powdered charcoal into this melted pine sap. I try to usually use about half the amount of charcoal that I do pine pitch. As you can see, with the amount of pine pitch I have here, I mixed about half, approximately, the amount of charcoal with that. So I'm just simply going to mix this together. I want to make sure it's mixed rather well. Alright, now that we're done, we can just simply roll this pine sap or this pine pitch and scoop it all down to one corner or one end. And then now at this point, our pitch glue is ready to be used. If you want to make yourself some pitch sticks, you can simply just roll yourself a stick around in this pitch until it solidifies. And just keep doing that until it grows larger and larger. And then you'll end up having a really big ball of pitch on the end of the stick, of pitch glue. And you can just carry these sticks with you and then heat them up over a fire in a quick survival situation and have yourself some quick glue. As you may be able to notice here, you can see that pine sap starting to build up. Now you can just go ahead and make that ball as big as you want or as small as you want. It doesn't really matter. It's up to you. This is ready to use as is for glue. Now you guys may remember that paper towel from earlier. Now paper towels are made out of synthetic material, so you can see how this didn't really stick too well. It doesn't adhere it very well because it's synthetic material. And this is just, as you can see, this is just crumbling to dust. This wasn't mixed very well, and it's a synthetic material. Now I don't know how well you guys can see this, but this black stuff that you see here is pine pitch glue. Now this is glue that I had glued this stone head that I had flint knapped into this war club that I had made. And this thing isn't coming out. As you can see, I cannot bring this thing out. It is stuck in there. And this is the efficiency and the effectiveness of pitch glue. So make sure that you're very careful with how you apply it and what substance or what recipe you use. Now for this, I had actually used cat fur involved with this pine sap to make this glue, to make it this solid. So I thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. If you want to learn more about edible or medicinal plants, make sure to subscribe.